Welcome to the Existentialist Society in Melbourne, Australia. Existentialism is an umbrella term covering diverse and often conflicting schools of thought. Consequently, we are not agreed on who or what is an existentialist. We simply agree to disagree. Now, I'm David Miller. I'm the Secretary of the Existentialist Society. And our speaker today is Adjunct Professor James Page. He's with the Department of Peace Studies at the University of New England. James.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you for the invitation. What I hope to speak about in this first phase of operations is a brief introduction, an overview of the particular publication which has prompted the invitation to speak, a background to the article, and my reflections on this particular article, which is a philosophy of peace. I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people of this continent and their custodianship of the land, and to acknowledge also the more recent migrants to this continent from all parts of the globe. My name is Jim Page. I'm an educationist with a special interest in peace research, and I'm particularly interested in philosophical issues with regard to peace education. I've got degrees in divinity, humanities, education and anthropology, and my PhD dealt with the ethico-philosophical foundations for peace education. And in 2020, I published an encyclopedia article dealing with the philosophy of peace. As it happens, section 14 of this article is entitled An Existentialist Philosophy of Peace. And it was this which prompted the invitation for me to give this seminar, Existentialism and the Philosophy of Peace. So let's see if I can deconstruct or rather have an overview of that particular section within the article on the philosophy of peace. I commence the article with a brief definition of existentialism, and I suggest existentialism is the view that truth cannot be objectified, but rather it can only be experienced. This is not to deny the objective reality of an entity, but rather to say that the limitations of language are such that this cannot be objectified. I then go on to talk about the philosophical analysis of peace and the application of that definition of existentialism to peace. And I suggest that ultimately peace cannot be objectified, but rather it can be experienced. Thus, attempts to specify what peace is are likely to be problematic. We thus speak of peace by illustration and negation. And I'll just say a little bit about that. Illustration, the easiest way to talk about this is to talk about the research on this, which shows, interestingly, that a common illustration when people are asked to talk about or describe peace is children playing, which is a very evocative image. What I mean by negation is that people will often talk about peace being the absence of war, which in itself is problematic. And at the conclusion of that paragraph, I suggest we can say in true existentialist fashion that we can only know peace through encounter or relationship. And elsewhere, I've pointed out that this is in common with some understandings of an ethics of care and feminist ethics. Pardon me. In the second part of the article, I rely upon very much John Macquarie's book, The Concept of Peace. Now, those in this seminar will probably be familiar with John Macquarie as a leading existentialist writer, philosopher and theologian. Now, John Macquarie defines a metaphysical concept as one, the boundaries of which cannot be precisely determined, not because we lack information, but because the concept itself turns out to have such depth and inexhaustibility that the more we explore it, the more we see that something further remains to be explored. John Macquarie advances the definition of peace as wholeness and interrelatedness. And he also suggests the fracturing of life as the opposite of peace. And Macquarie says that the quest for wholeness of life prompts three questions. And these are really very general questions, but important questions. What is of value? What is real and illusory? And how do we gain real peace? Pardon me. What I'll talk to now is a little bit about the background to the article. Firstly, just some comments about the definitional problem for peace. And at the commencement of this article on the philosophy of peace, I suggest that that's the definitional problem for peace is crucial. And there's a contrast, and I'm speaking in very general terms here, between a narrow and an extended definition of peace. The extended definition of peace is most closely associated with the work of Johann Galtung. And Johann Galtung has a typology of direct peace, which is the absence of direct conflict, or the absence of war, if you like. Structural peace, which can be defined as having just social orders. And cultural peace, which are harmonious and cooperative understandings between people. We can also talk about interpersonal peace and intrapersonal peace. Intrapersonal peace is probably the most difficult one, and we've already obliquely touched on this in our introductory discussion to this seminar. Perhaps the best articulation of intrapersonal peace was in the Gandhian dictum that one should be the peace you want to see in the world. Another way to look at the definitional problem of peace is to look at what we mean by war. Do we mean formal declaration of hostilities, or do we mean antagonism between nations and groups? Winston Churchill famously said that World War I and World War II were in fact one continuum, and they were just briefly interrupted by a cessation of overt hostilities. A Congolese friend of mine, or somebody with Congolese heritage, has said to me recently that in discussing war, we need to look at the roots of war, that war doesn't simply just happen ex nihilo, so to speak. So that's quite crucial. Thomas Aquinas says that peace is wrote of peace being a work of justice. So the complexity of peace is that it's sort of intertwined with justice. Now the problem is that both the narrow and the extended definitions by themselves don't seem to hold up. I'll just start with a narrow definition firstly, looking at peace as being the absence of war. Clearly that doesn't hold up, because you can have nations or parts of the world oppressing other parts of the world, and you can argue that that's what's going on now, without there being overt war. So that definition of war is a very limited one, and definition of peace is a very limited one. The problem with the extended definition of peace is that it can become very subjective. A famous criticism of Johann Galtung's extended definition of peace, of structural peace, was that it includes everything that Johann Galtung doesn't like. So there we have the dilemma. I'll now go on to my reflections on what I've written, the encyclopedia article. Well, firstly, defining existentialism is problematic, and I'm well aware that some may contest the definition that I've given. I'm relying in part upon a Hebrew understanding of truth through relationship, through dialectic. And I think that definition can also be supported through the work of Kierkegaard. I think it's important that we recognise that it's entirely appropriate, and this has already been touched in the seminar, that that there are differing definitions of what existentialism is. Three things I like about existentialism with regard to a philosophy of peace, and I'll just outline these briefly, and we can maybe tease these apart in later discussion. Firstly, if you take an existentialist view of peace, that implies some what we might call epistemic humility, and by that there's a recognition that we don't know, and that's much needed in our society, where there tends to be a view where everybody has an opinion and everybody must know things. The second point about an existentialist approach to peace and an existentialist approach to the philosophy of peace is that there's an emphasis on relationship. And relationships very important for peace, very important for dialogue, and I'll come to that in a moment as well. The final point is that an existentialist approach to the philosophy of peace arguably connects with a feminine perspective. And what is a feminine perspective of peace, and the feminist contribution to peace is in fact an extraordinarily complex issue, not the least of which because I identify as male. But there you have it. Interestingly, my view on that is changing. When I wrote the 2008, when I wrote my doctoral thesis, I argued strongly that the ethics of care should not necessarily be considered a feminist ethics. Now I'm starting to maybe change my mind a little bit. So where do we go from here? I think one of the lasting contributions or most important contributions of an existentialist approach to philosophy of peace is the middle one that I mentioned, and that is emphasising relationship. And relationship is linked up with this notion of dialogue. And it's interesting that the United Nations, that 2023 is the UN International Year of Dialogue as the Guarantee of Peace, Resolution 7732, by the initiative of Turkmenistan. Now, I'll say a little more about that. I mean, I'm sure I've mentioned this phrase, the United Nations, and there's people would like to have lots to say about that, but firstly, it's important to look at who initiated this resolution, a country who's a member of the Global South. And in terms of dialogue, in terms of relationship, it's really important to look at those who are less powerful in the world, less powerful in relationships. And that's quite crucial in peace and in peacemaking. In a way, if we look at this impasse between how we understand peace, perhaps that's a pointer to how we should be going. We should be looking to the voices of the less powerful. Second point about that is that it's quite a remarkable assertion that dialogue is a guarantee of peace. And having written quite a deal of peace and having been involved in many discussions about peace, I have to say that one of the problems is that there is an inevitable trend towards pessimism, of saying that how are we going to reform the world? How are we going to move towards peace? Well, this is quite a remarkable assertion. Dialogue is a guarantee of peace. And it's interesting to reflect upon that. And the final point about that, in reflecting upon that, is what I take away from that: dialogue is an important part of relationship. And if existentialism is saying anything, it's saying that we establish truth through relationship. That's what when we say we mean, that's what it means when we say we establish truth through experience. We establish truth through relationship. So that, as it were, I think is perhaps a hopeful mark to finish my opening comments on. That in dealing with the intractable problems of violence and injustice in the world, genuine dialogue offers perhaps a ray of hope. I'll now open the floor for objections.
Well, thank you, Adjunct Professor James Page, for your presentation on existentialism and the philosophy of peace.